In my 23 years investigating crimes, I'd never seen anything like this. Dr. Marcus Sterling, a respected physician, was found dead in his living room, dog leash around his neck, hands zip-tied. But the basement revealed the truth. 300 photos of unconscious patients, illegal surgeries, evidence he'd been drugging and assaulting victims for years. 3 criminals came to rob him, but discovered something far worse. What haunts me most isn't how he died, but the question: when killers prevent future crimes, who's really the victim? Subscribe to the channel because cases like Dr. Sterling's teach us to recognize the warning signs of predators hiding behind professional credentials before they strike again. April 18, 2024. The sun had barely crested over the suburban sprawl of Riverside County, California, when Detective Maria Santos received the call that would consume the next months of her life. 23 years on the force had taught her to read between the lines of dispatch reports, and this one carried all the hallmarks of something far more sinister than a simple welfare check. The address belonged to Dr. Marcus Sterling, a respected physician whose pristine 2-story home sat like a monument to success among the manicured lawns of Willowbrook Heights. But success, as Detective Santos had learned through countless cases, often cast the longest shadows. The gate stood wide open. That single detail would prove to be the thread that unraveled everything. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, the neighbor who'd made the initial call, had been awake since 4 in the morning with her colicky granddaughter. Through her kitchen window, she'd watched Dr. Sterling's wrought iron security gate swing lazily in the pre-dawn breeze, a sight so unusual it made her stomach clench with inexplicable dread. In the 3 years since Marcus Sterling had moved into the neighborhood, that gate had never remained open past sunset. Never. The doctor was a creature of habit, almost obsessively so. His colleagues at Riverside General often joked about his legendary punctuality, his methodical approach to everything, from patient rounds to his morning coffee routine. Sterling was the kind of man who programmed his sprinkler system down to the minute, who color-coded his filing systems, who never ever left his gate unsecured. But there it was, hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Mrs. Hoffman had waited. She'd told herself she was being paranoid, that maybe the doctor had simply forgotten in a moment of distraction. She'd busied herself with the baby, made coffee, even started a load of laundry. But as the hours crawled by and the gate remained stubbornly, unnaturally open, the knot in her stomach had grown tighter. By 8:30 she couldn't stand it anymore. The responding officers, Martinez and Chen, had seen their share of welfare checks that turned into something darker. The moment they pulled up to Sterling's address, both veterans felt that familiar prickle along their spines, the sixth sense that separated living cops from dead ones. The house looked wrong somehow, though neither could have articulated exactly why. Maybe it was the way the morning shadows fell across the front porch, or the unnatural stillness that seemed to emanate from behind those expensive windows. Or maybe it was the absence of life in a place that should have been humming with morning routine. Martinez approached the front door while Chen circled the perimeter, their radios crackling with routine chatter that seemed oddly inappropriate given the weight of the moment. The doorbell's cheerful chime echoed through what sounded like an empty house, followed by a silence so complete it felt almost aggressive. No answer, no movement. No sounds of someone rushing to explain away the mysterious open gate. Chen's voice crackled over the radio from the backyard. "Martinez, you need to see this." The sliding glass door that led from the patio into the house stood slightly ajar, just enough to make both officers' hands drift instinctively toward their weapons. Through the gap, they could see into what appeared to be an elegantly appointed living room. Cream-colored leather furniture, arranged with magazine-perfect precision. Abstract paintings that probably cost more than most people's cars. Everything exactly as it should be, except for the figure lying face down on the hardwood floor. Even from the doorway, even before they'd confirmed what they already knew in their guts, Martinez and Chen could see that Dr. Marcus Sterling would never again worry about closing his gate. The respected physician lay sprawled near his coffee table, in a position that spoke of violence, of final moments that had been anything but peaceful. But it was what they discovered when they moved closer that transformed a suspected heart attack or accident into something far more sinister. Sterling's hands were bound behind his back with what appeared to be zip ties, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. Around his neck, pulled tight enough to leave deep impressions in his skin, was a dog leash, an expensive leather one that probably belonged to a pet they hadn't yet found. The house held its secrets close. As Martinez secured the scene and Chen called for detectives, neither officer spoke aloud the questions that were already forming in their minds. Questions about how a successful doctor ends up dead in his own living room. Questions about who would want to hurt a man whose biggest controversy was his insistence on punctuality. Questions about what else they might find once the real investigation began. Detective Santos arrived 47 minutes after the initial call, her trained eyes already cataloging details before she'd even stepped out of her unmarked sedan. The open gate that had started it all now seemed less like forgotten routine and more like a final message, a last desperate signal from a man who'd realized too late that his perfectly ordered world was about to collapse. The house spoke to her in the language she'd learned to read over 2 decades of crime scenes. Expensive, but not ostentatious. Well-maintained, but lived in. The kind of place that suggested its owner had money, but wasn't the type to flaunt it. Sterling had been successful, respected, careful. The kind of man who made enemies through professional competence rather than personal conflicts, which made his violent death all the more puzzling. As Santos ducked under the crime scene tape, she caught sight of the body through the patio doors and felt that familiar surge of determination mixed with dread. Marcus Sterling deserved justice, and she would find it. But some cases, she knew from hard experience, exacted a price from everyone they touched. She had no way of knowing that this case would lead her into a world where respected professionals and career criminals collided in ways that would challenge everything she thought she knew about human nature. No way of knowing about the surveillance footage that would reveal secrets darker than a simple robbery gone wrong. No way of knowing that Dr. Sterling's death was just the beginning. The crime scene unit was already setting up their equipment when Detective Santos made her first call to the Riverside County Homicide Division. The conversation was brief, professional, and routine. But as she hung up the phone, Santos found herself staring at that still open gate and wondering what other doors this case would force her to walk through. Inside the house, the silence was absolute. Dr. Sterling's coffee maker had a timer that had dutifully brewed his morning cup at exactly 7:15, just as it had every day for the past 3 years. The coffee was cold now, adding an oddly domestic touch to a scene that was anything but ordinary. Santos pulled on her latex gloves and stepped into a world where someone's last night alive had become someone else's crime to solve. The hardwood floors gleamed under the crime scene lights, reflecting back images that would haunt her dreams for months to come. But she didn't know that yet. At that moment, staring down at Dr. Marcus Sterling's body, Detective Santos was simply a professional doing her job. She was cataloging evidence, forming theories, beginning the methodical process that would either bring a killer to justice or add another unsolved case to her growing collection of professional failures. What she couldn't know was that within hours, they would have surveillance footage showing 3 individuals entering and leaving Sterling's home. What she couldn't anticipate was how quickly that footage would lead them to a car, a confession, and a truth more disturbing than anything she'd imagined. What Detective Santos couldn't possibly foresee, as she knelt beside the body of a man who'd simply wanted to close his gate and go to sleep, was that this case would force her to confront the thin line between civilization and chaos, a line that someone had crossed in the worst possible way just hours before. The investigation was about to begin in earnest, and some investigations, once started, refuse to let go until they've claimed everyone in their path. The break in the case came faster than Detective Santos had dared to hope, but with it came revelations that would test even her seasoned stomach for the depths of human depravity. Diego Martinez, that was the name that emerged from the license plate traces within 6 hours of discovering Dr. Sterling's body. 42 years old, with a rap sheet that read like a manual for career criminality. Robbery, burglary, assault. A man who'd spent more time behind bars than most people spend in college, and who'd learned to navigate the system with the practiced ease of someone who'd made peace with his chosen profession. But Martinez had never killed anyone before. That distinction would prove crucial in the hours to come. Detective Santos found herself standing in the driveway of a modest duplex in East Riverside, watching as Martinez's mother-in-law opened her front door with the weary resignation of someone who'd answered too many questions from too many cops over too many years. Mrs. Rosa Hernandez was 63, a A woman whose hands bore the calluses of decades spent cleaning other people's houses so her daughter might have a better life. Her daughter had chosen Diego Martinez instead. "He took my car," Mrs. Hernandez said before Santos even finished her introductions. The older woman's voice carried no surprise, only the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for years. "I knew something was wrong when I saw him this morning. He had that look, that guilty look." The silver Honda Civic sat in the driveway exactly where the surveillance footage suggested it should be. Martinez hadn't even tried to hide it, hadn't attempted to create distance between himself and the vehicle that had carried him to and from the scene of Dr. Sterling's murder. It was either breathtaking arrogance or the kind of street-smart calculation that suggested he knew running would only make things worse. Santos would soon discover it was the latter. When they found Martinez in the cramped back bedroom of the duplex, he was sitting on an unmade bed, still wearing the same clothes from the surveillance footage, minus the dark jacket they'd later discover wadded up in a garbage bag behind the washing machine. His hands were steady as he lit a cigarette, and his eyes held the flat, calculating look of a man who'd been expecting this moment since the first police siren wailed across Riverside County that morning. "I was wondering when you'd get here," Martinez said, exhaling smoke toward a water-stained ceiling. "Figured it wouldn't take long once you found the old lady's car." Detective Santos had interrogated hundreds of suspects over her career, and she'd learned to read the subtle tells that separated the genuinely remorseful from the merely caught. Diego Martinez fell into neither category. He was a professional criminal who'd been caught red-handed, and he approached the situation with the same workmanlike pragmatism he might bring to any other business transaction. "We need to talk about last night," Santos said, settling into the plastic chair across from where Martinez sat. "About Dr. Marcus Sterling." Martinez took another drag from his cigarette and nodded slowly. "Yeah, I figured that's what this was about. Look, Detective, Santos, right? I'm not going to sit here and lie to you. We both know how this works. You got cameras, you got my car, you probably got my prints somewhere in that house. I'm not stupid." What followed was one of the most matter-of-fact confessions Detective Santos had ever witnessed. Martinez didn't lawyer up, didn't demand deals, didn't try to minimize his involvement. He simply began talking, laying out the events of the previous night with the detached precision of someone reading from a grocery list. "We went there to rob him," Martinez said. "That was always the plan. The whole party thing, that was just to get us inside without having to break down doors or deal with alarms." But as Martinez continued his confession, Santos realized that what they'd initially assumed was a robbery gone wrong was actually something far more calculated and far more disturbing. The party had been Dr. Sterling's idea, or so Martinez claimed. Through a mutual acquaintance, a man Martinez knew only as Leo, Sterling had allegedly reached out looking for what Martinez euphemistically called entertainment for a private gathering. The kind of entertainment that involved cash payments, no questions asked, and the sort of activities that a respected physician couldn't afford to have become public knowledge. "This Leo guy, he knew I had connections," Martinez explained, tapping ash into an empty beer bottle. "Girls who do whatever for the right price. He said his friend, the doctor, was looking for a good time, something private, something off the books." Santos felt her stomach clench as the true scope of Dr. Sterling's final night began to emerge. This wasn't just about robbery. This was about exploitation, about powerful men purchasing silence along with services, about a world that existed in the shadows, cast by respectability and professional success. Martinez continued his story with the same clinical detachment, describing how he'd contacted Jessica Moore, a 35-year-old woman who worked as what he politely termed an escort, to arrange the evening's activities. Moore had no criminal record, no outstanding warrants, no reason to assume that accepting what seemed like a routine job would end with her as an accessory to murder. "Jessica's good people," Martinez said, showing the first trace of something approaching emotion. "She didn't sign up for what happened. This was supposed to be easy money for everyone involved. But something had gone wrong almost from the moment they'd arrived at Dr. Sterling's house. According to Martinez, Sterling had been drinking heavily before they'd even arrived and had immediately begun using cocaine with the casual abandon of someone who'd crossed certain lines so many times that they'd forgotten where those lines had originally been drawn. The doctor, he was already messed up when we got there, Martinez recalled. Slurring his words, stumbling around, Jessica said she'd seen guys like that before, Guys who thought money meant they could do whatever they wanted. What Martinez described next painted a picture of Dr. Sterling that stood in stark contrast to the respected physician his colleagues thought they knew. According to the confession, Sterling had become increasingly aggressive as the evening progressed, making demands that went far beyond what had been agreed upon, treating Moore less like a person and more like property he'd purchased for the night. That's when Leo started talking about taking whatever we could find, Martinez said. The doctor was so wasted, he probably wouldn't even remember we'd been there. Leo figured we could take some stuff, make it look like a burglary and nobody would be the wiser. But Jessica Moore had brought something extra to the evening. A small vial of what Martinez described as sleepy juice, a cocktail of benzodiazepines and other sedatives that was sometimes used in her line of work to manage clients who became too demanding or aggressive. The plan, as Martinez told it, was to slip the drugs into Sterling's drink, wait for him to pass out and then ransack the house at leisure. The plan had failed spectacularly. The doctor didn't drink what Jessica tried to give him, Martinez said, crushing his cigarette against the beer bottle with more force than necessary. He got suspicious, started asking questions. That's when everything went sideways. According to Martinez's account, Dr. Sterling had realized that his guests weren't just there for the party he thought he'd arranged. Maybe it was paranoia brought on by the cocaine, or maybe it was some vestige of the intelligence that had made him a successful physician. But Sterling had suddenly understood that he was in danger. He tried to fight back, Martinez said quietly. Started yelling about calling the police, about knowing important people. Leo panicked. What happened next, according to Martinez, was a struggle that ended with Dr. Sterling on the floor of his living room, a dog leash that had been hanging in his hallway closet wrapped around his neck, his hands zip-tied behind his back with a phone charger cord they'd found near his couch. Leo said it was just to keep him quiet while we looked around, Martinez claimed. Said we'd let him go once we found whatever cash he had in the house. But the doctor kept struggling, kept trying to get loose, and then Martinez's voice trailed off. And for the first time during the confession, Detective Santos saw something that might have been genuine remorse flicker across his weathered features. And then he stopped moving. The aftermath, as Martinez described it, had been a frenzied scramble to take whatever they could carry before fleeing the scene. Moore had apparently grabbed food from Sterling's refrigerator and freezer. Steaks, frozen seafood, expensive wine. Loading everything into Sterling's Mercedes SUV, while Martinez and the mysterious Leo gathered electronics and anything else that might have resale value. Jessica was crying, Martinez remembered, kept saying this wasn't supposed to happen, that nobody was supposed to get hurt. But Leo, he was all business. Said we needed to take whatever we could find and get out before someone called the cops. The 5 alloy wheels with premium tires, the microwave, Sterling's cell phone, all of it had been loaded into the doctor's vehicle, which Martinez had then driven to a parking lot 3 miles away, before abandoning it and walking back to meet Moore and Leo, who'd followed in Mrs. Hernandez's Honda Civic. By the time I got back to them, Jessica was talking about going to the police, Martinez said. Leo told her that would be stupid, that we'd all go down for murder if she opened her mouth. Said the only thing to do was keep quiet and pretend none of this ever happened. But keeping quiet, as Detective Santos now knew, had never been an option. Not with surveillance cameras that had captured their arrival and departure, not with evidence scattered across the crime scene, and certainly not with Martinez himself proving surprisingly willing to cooperate with investigators. I've been locked up before, Martinez explained when Santos asked why he was being so forthcoming. I know how this works. You cooperate. Maybe things go easier for you. You fight, and they throw everything they've got at you. I'm too old to spend the rest of my life behind bars for something that was never supposed to happen in the first place. But Martinez's cooperation came with conditions. He'd confessed to his role in the robbery, he'd help police recover the stolen items, and he'd even wear a wire if it would help them catch the man he insisted was the real killer, the mysterious Leo, whose last name Martinez claimed not to know, and whom he'd met during a previous stint in county lockup. Leo's the one you want, Martinez insisted as Santos prepared to formally book him. He's the one who put that leash around the doctor's neck. He's the one who decided we should take everything we could carry. Me and Jessica, we just went along with it because we were scared. Whether Martinez was telling the truth about his limited role in Dr. Sterling's death would ultimately be determined by forensic evidence and additional confessions. But his detailed account had given investigators exactly what they needed: to track down the other two participants in what was rapidly revealing itself to be one of the most disturbing cases in Riverside County's recent history. By 6 o'clock that evening, Detective Santos had obtained search warrants for Martinez's residence, arrest warrants for Jessica Moore and the man known as Leo, and a sick feeling in her stomach that told her the worst revelations were yet to come. The hunt for Jessica Moore began immediately, with every patrol unit in the county carrying her photograph and last known addresses. Unlike Martinez, who'd essentially surrendered himself, Moore was actively evading capture, having apparently realized that her brief foray into what she'd thought was routine sex work had transformed her into an accessory to murder. They found her 18 hours later in a dive bar called Murphy's Tavern, 3 miles from Dr. Sterling's house, apparently trying to drink away the memory of the previous night. When Detective Santos and her partner approached Moore's table, the woman didn't run, didn't resist, didn't even seem surprised to see them. Jessica Moore looked exactly like what she was, a woman who'd made too many compromises for too many years and had finally found herself in a situation where all the compromises in the world wouldn't be enough to save her. 35 years old but looking older, with bleached blonde hair that needed touching up, and clothes that had probably been expensive once, but now simply looked tired. "I've been waiting for you," Moore said, as Santos showed her badge. "I knew you'd find me eventually." The confession that followed painted an even darker picture of Dr. Sterling's final hours, one that would force investigators to confront uncomfortable questions about power, exploitation, and the thin veneer of civilization that separates the respected from the reviled. But even as Moore's story emerged, confirming many of Martinez's claims while adding disturbing new details, one crucial piece of the puzzle remained missing. The man known as Leo, whose real name was Leonard Hayes, had vanished completely, leaving behind only the scattered evidence of his role in Dr. Sterling's death and a trail that seemed to lead nowhere. The search for Leonard Hayes would prove to be the most challenging aspect of the investigation, leading Detective Santos into a world of paroled convicts, underground networks, and secrets that some people would kill to protect. But she had no way of knowing that yet. As she sat across from Jessica Moore in a dingy interrogation room, listening to a woman describe the worst night of her life, Santos could only focus on building the case that would bring justice for Dr. Marcus Sterling. What she couldn't anticipate was how much more complicated that justice would become. Sunday evening brought the kind of California twilight that normally made people think of barbecues and family gatherings. But Detective Santos spent those golden hours hunched over surveillance monitors and arrest warrants, knowing that somewhere in Riverside County, a killer was walking free. Leonard Hayes had been a ghost for 48 hours. No credit card transactions, no cell phone pings, no social media activity. For a man fresh out of county lockup, with limited resources and fewer friends, Hayes had managed to vanish with the thoroughness of someone who understood that his freedom, perhaps his life, depended on staying invisible. But ghosts, as Santos had learned over 23 years of police work, always left traces. And Leonard Hayes's trace came in the form of a phone call to the anonymous tip line at exactly 7:42 p.m. "There's a guy at Murphy's Tavern who's been talking about some doctor getting killed." The voice was female, nervous, probably someone who'd had too much to drink and too much exposure to true crime podcasts. "He's been buying drinks for everyone, acting like he's some kind of big shot. Says he knows things about that murder on the news." Detective Santos was pulling into the Murphy's Tavern parking lot 12 minutes later, her partner, Detective Rodriguez, beside her, both of them running on coffee, adrenaline, and the grim satisfaction of knowing that criminals almost always talked too much when they thought they were safe. Murphy's Tavern was the kind of establishment that existed in the margins of every American city, a place where day laborers cashed their checks, where ex-cons drank away their parole meetings, where conversations happened in whispers and cash changed hands without receipts. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke, despite California's smoking ban, and the lighting was dim enough to hide the years of accumulated stains on the walls and floors. Leonard Hayes sat at the far end of the bar like a man holding court, a half-empty bottle of Jim Beam in front of him, and 3 other patrons hanging on his every word. At 38, Hayes looked older than his years, the kind of premature aging that came from hard living, harder choices, and the constant stress of looking over your shoulder. His hands shook slightly as he gestured, Whether from alcohol withdrawal or nervous energy, Santos couldn't tell. "I'm telling you, that doctor had it coming," Hayes was saying as Santos approached, her badge visible but not yet announced. "You should have seen his house, man. Rich bastard living like a king while honest people can't even afford rent." The irony of Leonard Hayes, a man with convictions for armed robbery, assault, and drug possession, referring to himself as honest people, wasn't lost on Detective Santos. But she'd learned long ago that criminals possessed an almost supernatural ability to reframe their actions as justified responses to an unfair world. "Leonard Hayes," Santos said, her voice cutting through the tavern's ambient noise like a blade. "We need to talk." The transformation in Hayes's demeanor was immediate and complete. The swaggering storyteller vanished, replaced by a man who suddenly understood that his 48 hours of freedom had come to an end. His shoulders sagged, his hands stopped their restless movement, and when he looked up at Santos, she saw resignation mixed with something that might have been relief. "I figured you'd find me eventually," Hayes said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Couldn't stay hidden forever." The arrest happened without incident. Hayes didn't run, didn't resist, didn't even ask for a lawyer. He simply stood up, allowed Santos to cuff him, and walked out of Murphy's Tavern like a man going to an appointment he'd been dreading, but knew was inevitable. It wasn't until they were in the interrogation room at Riverside County Sheriff's Department that Leonard Hayes began to tell his version of the story that had led to Dr. Marcus Sterling's death. And what he revealed would force Detective Santos to confront uncomfortable truths about the victim she'd been seeking justice for. "I met the doctor about 3 weeks before he died," Hayes began, his hands folded on the metal table between them. "It was at a bar called the Rusty Anchor down in the Warehouse District. Not the kind of place you'd expect to find a doctor, but there he was, buying drinks and talking to anyone who'd listen." According to Hayes, Dr. Sterling had been a regular at the Rusty Anchor for months, drawn not by the ambience, which was non-existent, but by the anonymity it provided. Here, among the construction workers and ex-cons and people living on society's margins, a respected physician could indulge appetites that would have destroyed his reputation if discovered by his professional peers. "He told me he was looking for friends," Hayes continued, his voice taking on the flat, matter-of-fact tone that Santos recognized from years of taking confessions. "Said he liked to throw parties at his house, but he needed the right kind of people. People who wouldn't judge him for how he wanted to live his life." The picture that emerged from Hayes's confession was of a man living a dangerous double life. Dr. Marcus Sterling, respected physician and pillar of the community, was also a middle-aged man whose appetites had grown increasingly extreme as his professional success isolated him from meaningful human connection. "He was into some weird stuff," Hayes said, his discomfort with the subject evident despite his criminal background. "Sex parties, drugs, paying people to do things that normal people wouldn't do for free. He had money, and he thought that meant he could buy whatever he wanted." Over the course of several meetings at the Rusty Anchor, Sterling had gradually revealed more about his desires. He was looking for what he called open-minded individuals who would be willing to participate in private gatherings at his home. The compensation, he'd assured Hayes, would be generous. The activities, he'd implied, would be consensual among adults. What Sterling hadn't mentioned, according to Hayes, was that his definition of consensual had become increasingly flexible as his appetites grew darker. For the third time I met him, he started talking about how he wanted to throw this big party, Hayes recalled. Said he needed at least one woman who would be accommodating, and maybe a couple of guys who wouldn't be shocked by what they saw. He offered me $500 just to help set it up. Detective Santos felt her stomach tighten as Hayes's story unfolded. The investigation had already revealed that Dr. Sterling's reputation as a respectable physician masked a darker reality, but Hayes's account suggested depths of depravity that even she hadn't anticipated. "I told him I knew a guy, Diego, who might be interested," Hayes continued, "and Diego knew this woman, Jessica, who did escort work. We all needed money, and the doctor was offering good cash for what seemed like a one-night thing. But as Hayes described the planning for what would become Dr. Sterling's final night, it became clear that the line between victim and perpetrator was more blurred than anyone had initially realized. Sterling hadn't just been an innocent mark targeted by criminals, he'd been an active participant in arranging his own destruction. "The doctor gave me the code to his security gate," Hayes said, told me exactly when to come, what door to use, even what kind of alcohol to bring. He was excited about it, you know, like a kid planning his birthday party. The irony wasn't lost on Detective Santos. Dr. Sterling had been so eager to indulge his darkest fantasies that he'd essentially invited his killers into his home, given them access to his security systems, and created the perfect conditions for his own murder. But Hayes's confession also revealed new details about the night itself, details that painted an even more disturbing picture of Dr. Sterling's final hours. When we got there, the doctor was already messed up, Hayes said. Drunk, high, talking crazy. He kept saying things about what he wanted to do to Jessica, things that made my skin crawl, and I've heard some sick stuff in my time. According to Hayes, Dr. Sterling had been using his medical knowledge to enhance his drug experiences, combining alcohol with pharmaceutical-grade narcotics in ways that would have been dangerous even for someone with his training. By the time his guests arrived, Sterling was already too intoxicated to realize that the evening wasn't going to unfold the way he'd planned. That's when Diego started talking about robbing the place, Hayes continued. Said the doctor was so wasted he'd never even remember we'd been there. And honestly, the way Sterling was acting, talking about the things he wanted to do, part of me thought he deserved whatever happened to him. But Hayes's story diverged significantly from the accounts given by Diego Martinez and Jessica Moore when it came to the actual events that led to Dr. Sterling's death. While Martinez had claimed that Hayes was the primary instigator of the violence, Hayes painted himself as a reluctant participant who'd left the room when things got out of hand. I didn't want any part of what Diego was planning, Hayes insisted. When I saw him grab those zip ties, when I saw Jessica trying to put something in the doctor's drink, I knew this was going to end bad. So I went outside to the backyard. According to Hayes, he'd spent the crucial moments of Dr. Sterling's death alone in the physician's elaborate backyard garden, smoking cigarettes and trying to convince himself that whatever was happening inside the house wasn't his responsibility. It was only when he heard shouting and then sudden ominous silence that he'd understood how far things had gone. When I came back inside, the doctor was on the floor, Hayes said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Diego was standing over him with this dog leash in his hands, and Jessica was crying. I knew right then that we were all screwed. But even Hayes's account of the aftermath raised troubling questions about the true nature of Dr. Sterling's death. While he described a frenzied scramble to gather valuables and flee the scene, he also revealed details about the crime scene that suggested a level of premeditation that went beyond a simple robbery gone wrong. Diego knew exactly where to look for stuff, Hayes recalled. Like he'd been planning this for weeks, he went straight to the doctor's bedroom, found a safe behind a painting, knew which electronics were worth taking, which jewelry was real. It was like he'd cased the place beforehand. This revelation forced Detective Santos to reconsider everything she thought she knew about the crime. If Martinez had indeed scouted Sterling's home prior to the murder, it suggested that the party had been planned as a robbery from the beginning, with Sterling as an unwitting accomplice in his own destruction. But Hayes's most disturbing revelation came when Santos pressed him about Dr. Sterling's medical practice. The crime scene investigation had uncovered evidence that Sterling had been operating some kind of unlicensed medical facility out of his home, and Hayes provided context that made the discovery even more sinister. The doctor told me he did procedures at his house, Hayes said. Cosmetic stuff mostly. Botox, fillers, even some surgical work. Said he could do things there that he couldn't do in a regular clinic because the regulations were too strict. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Dr. Sterling hadn't just been engaging in dangerous personal behavior. He'd been operating an unlicensed medical practice that put patients at risk while generating unreported income that attracted the attention of criminals. He had this whole setup in his basement, Hayes continued. Medical equipment, surgical tools, even an operating table. Said he charged cash only. No insurance, no paperwork. People came to him when they wanted work done, but couldn't afford a real plastic surgeon. Detective Santos made notes as Hayes spoke, but part of her mind was already racing ahead to the implications. If Sterling had been operating an illegal medical practice, it opened up entirely new avenues of investigation. How many patients had he treated? Had any of them been harmed by his unlicensed procedures? And most importantly, had his illegal activities somehow led to his murder? The doctor was paranoid about getting caught, Hayes said. That's part of why he liked having people like us around. Criminals who wouldn't go running to the medical board if something went wrong. He thought he could trust us, because we had as much to lose as he did. It was a calculation that had proven fatally flawed. Doctor, Sterling had surrounded himself with criminals because he thought they would be discreet about his illegal activities, but he'd failed to consider that the same desperation that made them willing to keep his secrets also made them willing to kill him for his money. The medical examiner's preliminary findings, which Detective Santos reviewed while Hayes was being processed into county lockup, confirmed the worst aspects of his confession. Doctor, Sterling had died from strangulation, but the violence had been extensive and deliberate. The dog leash around his neck had been tightened with enough force to fracture his trachea in 2 places. The zip ties around his wrists had been pulled tight enough to cut off circulation. This wasn't the work of someone who'd simply panicked during a robbery. This was torture, prolonged and intentional, carried out by someone who'd wanted Dr. Sterling to suffer before he died. The toxicology report, when it arrived 3 days later, revealed cocaine, alcohol, and traces of benzodiazepines in Sterling's system, a combination that would have left him disoriented and unable to defend himself effectively. But it also revealed something else that made Detective Santos's blood run cold: evidence of Rohypnol, the date rape drug, in concentrations that suggested it had been administered shortly before his death. This confirmed Jessica Moore's account of attempting to drug Sterling's drink, but it also raised new questions about what had been planned for the physician's final hours. Had the criminals simply intended to rob him while he was unconscious, or had they planned something even worse? The cell phone evidence extracted through court-ordered warrants provided the final pieces of the puzzle. Text messages between Hayes and Martinez showed that they'd been planning to rob Sterling for at least a week before the murder. Messages between Martinez and Moore revealed discussions about drugs and their effects on victims. And most damning of all, messages from Sterling himself showed that he'd been actively cooperating in planning what he thought would be an evening of paid sexual encounters. But the most chilling discovery came from Sterling's own phone records. In the days leading up to his death, he'd been researching methods of restraint, discussing consensual non-consent scenarios, and messaging with individuals whose identities were still being investigated by the Cyber Crimes Unit. Dr. Marcus Sterling hadn't just been the victim of a random crime. He'd been an active participant in a subculture of exploitation and violence that had ultimately consumed him. His killers were criminals, certainly, but they'd been enabled by Sterling's own willingness to use his wealth and status to purchase degrading experiences from desperate people. The case that had begun as a simple robbery homicide had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. Detective Santos found herself investigating not just a murder, but an entire underground network of illegal medical procedures, drug-facilitated sexual assault, and exploitation that reached into corners of Riverside County she'd never imagined. As the evidence mounted against all 3 suspects, Santos realized that bringing them to justice would only be the beginning. The real challenge would be unraveling the web of corruption and exploitation that had made Dr. Sterling's murder possible in the first place. But she also knew that some investigations changed the investigators as much as they revealed the truth about the crimes. As she sat in her office late that Sunday night, reviewing witness statements and crime scene photos, Detective Santos couldn't shake the feeling that she'd opened a door that could never be closed again. The murder of Dr. Marcus Sterling was solved, but the darkness it had revealed would haunt everyone it touched for years to come. And somewhere in the shadows of Riverside County, other predators and other victims were still playing out the same deadly game that had cost Sterling his life. The hunt for justice was far from over. It was just beginning to reveal how deep the corruption really went. The house told stories that Dr. Marcus Sterling could no longer deny. Detective Santos had walked through thousands of crime scenes over her career, but Sterling's home was different. It wasn't just the location where a murder had occurred. It was a psychological landscape that revealed the slow deterioration of a man who'd lost his way in the maze of his own desires. Standing in the doorway of what had once been Sterling's bedroom, Santos felt the weight of understanding settle over her like a shroud. The room was chaos incarnate. Clothes scattered across expensive furniture, medical equipment mixed with personal items, in ways that spoke of a mind gradually losing its ability to maintain boundaries between professional and personal, legal and illegal, acceptable and abhorrent. But it was the basement that truly revealed the depths of Sterling's descent into darkness. Dr. Marcus Sterling had transformed the lower level of his suburban home into something that defied easy categorization. Part medical clinic, part theatrical set, part shrine to appetites that had grown increasingly dangerous as they'd grown increasingly desperate to be fed. The surgical table dominated the center of the room, a professional-grade piece of equipment that belonged in a hospital, not a residential basement. Surrounding it were medical instruments, bottles of anesthetic, surgical lights that could be adjusted to illuminate procedures that should never have been performed outside a licensed facility. "Jesus Christ," Detective Rodriguez whispered, running his hand along the edge of the operating table. This guy was running a full surgical suite down here, but Rodriguez was only seeing part of the picture. Santos's trained eye caught the details that painted an even more disturbing portrait of Sterling's activities. The lighting rig mounted on the ceiling wasn't just for surgery, it was the kind of professional setup used for filming. The multiple camera mounts positioned around the room suggested that Sterling hadn't just been performing illegal medical procedures, he'd been documenting them. In the corner of the basement, arranged with the careful attention to detail that characterized everything in Sterling's life, stood a medical mannequin. But this wasn't the kind used in medical schools for training purposes. This mannequin had been modified, enhanced with features that served purposes no legitimate medical education would require. "Detective Santos," Officer Chen called from across the room. "You need to see this." Chen was standing in front of a wall-mounted cabinet that had been concealed behind what appeared to be a wine rack. Inside, arranged with the same obsessive organization that Sterling applied to everything else, were bottles of pharmaceuticals that told their own story of gradual corruption. Rohypnol, ketamine, midazolam, propofol. Every drug needed to render someone unconscious, helpless, unable to consent to or remember what was being done to them. Some of the bottles bore legitimate pharmaceutical labels, suggesting Sterling had been diverting drugs from his medical practice. Others had no labels at all, suggesting connections to sources that operated far outside the boundaries of legal medicine. "He was drugging people," Santos said, her voice flat with the kind of certainty that came from seeing too many cases where respected professionals had used their positions to exploit the vulnerable. This whole setup, the parties, the medical procedures, he was using drugs to make people compliant. The basement also contained something that would haunt Detective Santos's dreams for months to come. A filing cabinet filled with photographs. Not medical documentation, but something far more sinister. Images of patients who'd come to Sterling for cosmetic procedures, but who'd apparently received much more than they'd bargained for. The photographs showed people in various states of consciousness, some clearly alert and consenting, others obviously drugged beyond the point of awareness. The dates on the photos went back months, suggesting that Sterling's basement activities had been escalating for some time before the night that cost him his life. "How many victims are we talking about?" Rodriguez asked, flipping through files that contained not just photographs, but detailed notes about procedures, drug dosages, and what Sterling euphemistically referred to as patient responses. Santos didn't answer immediately. She was staring at a photograph that showed a young woman, barely conscious, undergoing what appeared to be unnecessary surgical procedures, while Sterling's notes detailed her inability to object due to sedation protocols. "Too many," Santos finally said. "Way too many." The crime scene team would eventually catalog over 300 photographs spanning 18 months of illegal procedures. Many showed individuals who appeared to be under the influence of drugs, undergoing surgeries that went far beyond the cosmetic work they'd supposedly consented to receive. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came when Santos opened Sterling's appointment book, a leather-bound journal where he'd meticulously recorded his basement activities. The entries read like the notes of a man who'd convinced himself that his crimes were medical procedures, that his exploitation was research, that his victims were willing participants in experiments they'd never agreed to undergo. "Patient expressed interest in enhancement procedures," read one entry from 3 weeks before Sterling's death. "Administered pre-operative sedation as agreed. Patient remained comfortable throughout extended procedure. No complaints or memory of discomfort upon awakening." The clinical language couldn't disguise what the photographs made clear. Sterling had been sexually assaulting unconscious patients under the guise of medical procedures, documenting his crimes with the same obsessive attention to detail he'd once applied to legitimate medical practice. "This changes everything," Santos said, closing the appointment book, with hands that trembled slightly despite her years of experience with the worst humanity had to offer. Sterling wasn't just a victim of robbery. He was a predator who finally picked the wrong people to victimize. The revelation forced Detective Santos to reconsider every aspect of the case. Diego Martinez, Jessica Moore, and Leonard Hayes were still killers who would face justice for their crimes. But they'd also been walking into a situation where the supposed victim was arguably more dangerous than they were. As the investigation team continued processing the basement, Santos found herself grappling with questions that had no easy answers. How many people had been victimized in this room? How many had woken up with no memory of what had been done to them, perhaps attributing strange physical symptoms to normal surgical recovery? How many had been too afraid or confused to come forward? The 3 hours that Martinez, Moore, and Hayes had spent in Sterling's house on the night of his death took on new meaning in light of these discoveries. They hadn't just been there to rob a wealthy physician. They'd been there to participate in activities that would have made them victims of Sterling's predatory behavior. According to the confessions, Sterling had been intoxicated and aggressive from the moment his guests arrived. His behavior, as described by all 3 killers, suggested a man who felt entitled to do whatever he pleased to people he viewed as disposable. The fact that his chosen victims had turned the tables on him created a moral complexity that would challenge prosecutors, defense attorneys, and jury members alike. "The doctor was already high when we got there," Jessica Moore had told investigators during her confession. "He kept talking about what he wanted to do, showing us around his basement like it was some kind of playground. He had this look in his eyes, like he thought he owned us." The surveillance footage confirmed that Sterling himself had provided the security code that allowed his killers to enter his property. He'd given them explicit instructions about which entrance to use, what time to arrive, and even what they should bring with them. In his eagerness to indulge his darkest fantasies, Sterling had essentially orchestrated his own murder. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came when investigators examined Sterling's computer files. The hard drives contained not just photographs of his basement activities, but correspondence with other individuals who shared his interests. The emails revealed a network of professionals, doctors, lawyers, business executives, who'd been trading information about drugs, techniques, and victims. "We're looking at a whole underground network," Santos told her lieutenant, during a briefing that would expand the investigation far beyond Sterling's death. This wasn't just one sick doctor. This was organized exploitation involving multiple predators and possibly hundreds of victims. The computer files also revealed that Sterling had been planning something special for the night he died. His emails from the days leading up to the murder showed him discussing a new kind of party with unnamed correspondents, describing scenarios that would have involved multiple victims and extended periods of unconsciousness. Martinez, Moore, and Hayes had unknowingly walked into what was intended to be Sterling's most ambitious night of criminal activity. Instead, they'd ended it permanently. The investigation's rapid pace had been driven by excellent police work, but also by the killer's own lack of sophistication. They'd left evidence everywhere, made no attempt to disguise their identities, and stayed in the immediate area after committing murder. Their amateurish approach to crime had made them easy to catch, but it had also ensured that Sterling's much more sophisticated criminal enterprise would be exposed. They were small-time criminals who stumbled into something much bigger than they understood, Santos reflected as she reviewed the case files. In trying to rob one predator, they accidentally exposed an entire network of them. The basement crime scene would take investigators 3 weeks to fully process. Every surface yielded fingerprints, DNA evidence, drug residues, and other forensic material that painted a picture of systematic criminal activity spanning years. The medical equipment alone was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, all of it purchased with cash through intermediaries who asked no questions about why a licensed physician needed to equip a basement operating room. But it was the human cost that weighed most heavily on Detective Santos's mind. As investigators began contacting individuals whose photographs appeared in Sterling's files, a pattern emerged of people who'd sought cosmetic procedures from someone they'd trusted, only to wake up with gaps in their memory and physical evidence of trauma they couldn't explain. "I thought I'd just had a reaction to the anesthesia," one victim told investigators. "I was sore in places that didn't make sense for the procedure I'd agreed to, but the doctor said that was normal. He gave me pain medication and told me not to worry about it." Another victim described waking up with injuries that had nothing to do with the lip injections she'd paid for, but Sterling had convinced her that complications were common and that she should keep quiet to avoid damaging his reputation and her own. The manipulation was as sophisticated as the medical procedures. Sterling had used his professional credentials, his expensive home, and his ability to provide legitimate medical services to gain the trust of victims who never realized they were being exploited until investigators showed them photographic evidence of what had really happened during their procedures. By the time Detective Santos finished cataloging the evidence from Sterling's basement, she understood that the investigation had uncovered something far more significant than a single murder. They'd exposed a predator whose crimes had been hidden behind professional respectability, whose victims had been silenced by shame and confusion, and whose network of criminal associates was still operating in the shadows of Riverside County's medical community. The three individuals who'd killed Sterling would face justice for their crimes. Martinez, Moore, and Hayes had committed murder, and Detective Santos would ensure they were held accountable for their actions. But she also understood that their victims had been a monster, whose death had likely prevented countless future crimes. The moral complexity of the case would challenge everyone involved in seeking justice for Sterling's death. How do you prosecute someone for killing a predator? How do you balance the crime of murder against the prevention of future sexual assaults? How do you explain to a jury that the victim was arguably more dangerous than his killers? These were questions that would be answered in courtrooms and legal briefs over the months to come. But as Detective Santos stood in Sterling's basement, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes, she knew that the real justice would come from exposing the network of predators he'd been part of and ensuring that his victims finally received the support and recognition they deserved. The investigation into Sterling's murder was complete, but the investigation into his crimes was just beginning. And somewhere in the shadows of Riverside County, other predators were watching the news coverage and wondering if their own secrets would soon be exposed. The case that had begun with a simple welfare check had evolved into something that would reshape how investigators understood the intersection of professional respectability and criminal behavior. Dr. Marcus Sterling's death had revealed a world where credentials could be used as weapons, where trust could be exploited for the darkest purposes, and where the most dangerous predators often wore the most respectable masks. Detective Santos closed her notebook and prepared to leave the basement that had taught her more about human evil than 23 years of police work had prepared her for. But she knew that the lessons learned in Sterling's House of Horrors would inform every case she worked for the rest of her career. Some crimes, she'd learned, were committed by people everyone trusted, and sometimes justice came in forms that no one expected. 6 months after Dr. Marcus Sterling's death, Detective Maria Santos sat in a courtroom watching 3 killers receive sentences that would define the rest of their lives. But justice, she'd learned, was far more complicated than she'd ever imagined when she first walked through that open gate in Willowbrook Heights. Diego Martinez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The 42-year-old career criminal, who'd wrapped a dog leash around Sterling's neck, showed no emotion as the judge read his sentence, but Santos caught him glancing toward the gallery where 2 of Sterling's victims sat. Women who'd come forward after the basement evidence was made public, women who'd finally understood what had really happened to them during what they'd thought were routine cosmetic procedures. Jessica Moore received 25 years to life. Her sentence reduced slightly due to her cooperation with investigators and her lawyer's successful argument that she'd been as much a potential victim as a perpetrator. At 35, Moore would be eligible for parole when she was 60, assuming she survived that long in a prison system that didn't look kindly on those who participated in murders, regardless of the circumstances. Leonard Hayes, whose confession had provided crucial details about Sterling's criminal network, received 30 years to life. His cooperation had been instrumental in identifying other victims and exposing the web of professionals who'd been involved in Sterling's basement activities, but cooperation couldn't erase the fact that he'd helped plan and execute a murder, even if the victim had been a monster. The sentences were just, Detective Santos reflected, as she watched the three defendants being led away in shackles. They'd committed murder, and they would pay the price that society demanded for taking a life. But the complexity of the case had forced everyone involved, prosecutors, defense attorneys, jury members, and investigators, to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, victimhood, and the sometimes blurry line between right and wrong. The trial had lasted 4 months, during which time the prosecution had been forced to present evidence not just of Sterling's murder, but of his crimes against the dozens of victims who'd been exploited in his basement operating room. The defense had argued that Martinez, Moore, and Hayes had walked into a situation where they themselves were intended victims, that Sterling's death had been the result of a struggle that began when he attempted to drug and assault Moore. The jury had ultimately rejected the defense's argument, finding all 3 defendants guilty of first-degree murder, with special circumstances that made them eligible for life sentences. But the deliberation had taken 8 days, suggesting that even 12 citizens randomly selected from the community had struggled with the moral complexity of convicting people for killing a predator. The real victory, Santos knew, hadn't happened in the courtroom. It had happened in the weeks and months following Sterling's death, as investigators had systematically dismantled the network of exploitation he'd been part of and brought justice to victims who'd been silenced for years. The computer files found in Sterling's basement had led to investigations in 3 states and resulted in the arrests of 11 other professionals who'd been involved in similar criminal activities. Dr. Richard Blackwood, a plastic surgeon in Beverly Hills, was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for operating an illegal clinic that catered to clients who wanted procedures performed on unwilling victims. Attorney Mark Stevens received 15 years for providing legal cover for the network and helping to silence victims through intimidation and financial settlements. Most significantly, the investigation had exposed Dr. Sarah Chen, a respected anesthesiologist who'd been providing pharmaceutical-grade drugs to network members for use in their crimes. Chen's arrest had led to a federal investigation that ultimately revealed a sophisticated operation involving medical professionals across the western United States who'd been exploiting their positions to access drugs and equipment used to victimize vulnerable patients. But it was the victims who provided the most powerful testimony about the impact of Sterling's crimes and the relief they felt knowing that their tormentor could never hurt anyone again. Maria Rodriguez had been 23 when she'd gone to Sterling for what she'd thought would be a simple lip enhancement procedure. She'd woken up hours later than expected, sore in places that had nothing to do with her lips, with no memory of most of the procedure. Sterling had convinced her that complications were normal, that the pain and confusion she felt were typical side effects of anesthesia. For 3 years, Rodriguez had struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and a deep sense that something terrible had happened to her. She'd even returned to Sterling for follow-up appointments, where he'd performed additional procedures that she hadn't consented to, always explaining away her concerns with medical jargon and professional authority. When Detective Santos showed me those photographs, when I finally understood what had really been done to me, I felt sick for days, Rodriguez testified during the trial. But I also felt relief, because I finally understood that I wasn't crazy, that something really had happened to me. Rodriguez was one of 47 victims who'd been identified through Sterling's meticulously kept records. They ranged in age from 19 to 58, represented every economic background and ethnicity, and shared only one common characteristic. They'd all trusted a medical professional who'd used that trust to exploit them in the most intimate and degrading ways possible. The youngest victim, 19-year-old college student Amanda Foster, had gone to Sterling for a consultation about acne treatment and had woken up hours later with evidence of sexual assault and no memory of how it had occurred. She'd been too confused and ashamed to report what had happened, especially since Sterling had convinced her that she'd consented to additional procedures to address what he'd called underlying skin conditions. "I thought I was going crazy," Foster told investigators. "I knew something was wrong, but Dr. Sterling was so professional, so convincing. He had medical degrees on his wall, testimonials from other patients. Who was I going to believe, my own confused memories or a respected doctor?" The oldest victim, 58-year-old retired teacher Margaret Williams, had sought treatment for age-related skin issues and had endured months of procedures that went far beyond anything she'd agreed to. Sterling had gradually escalated his abuse, using his medical authority to convince Williams that increasingly invasive and inappropriate procedures were necessary for her health. "He stole years of my life," Williams said during her victim impact statement. "I lived with pain and confusion and shame, never understanding why I felt so violated after medical appointments. Knowing that he's dead doesn't bring back those years, but it means he can never do to anyone else what he did to me." The investigation had also revealed the sophisticated methods Sterling and his network had used to avoid detection. They targeted victims who were unlikely to report crimes, individuals seeking procedures they couldn't afford through legitimate channels, people dealing with addiction or mental health issues, immigrants who feared contact with authorities. Sterling had also cultivated relationships with suppliers who provided drugs and equipment without asking questions, paid cash for everything to avoid creating paper trails, and maintained multiple sets of medical records to hide his illegal activities from legitimate oversight bodies. Perhaps most disturbingly, the investigation had revealed that Sterling's basement operation had been evolving toward even more serious crimes. Communications found on his computer suggested that he'd been planning to expand into human trafficking, working with associates who could provide victims for extended periods of exploitation. Dr. Sterling wasn't just a predator, FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh told the media after the federal indictments were announced. He was part of a criminal organization that was growing more ambitious and more dangerous over time. His death likely prevented crimes that would have been far worse than anything we've documented so far. The ripple effects of the Sterling case extended far beyond the criminal justice system. The California Medical Board instituted new oversight procedures for physicians operating outside traditional medical facilities. The Drug Enforcement Administration implemented stricter controls on pharmaceutical distribution to prevent medical professionals from diverting controlled substances for criminal purposes. Most importantly, the case had sparked a national conversation about the vulnerability of patients seeking cosmetic procedures and the need for better protections against medical professionals who exploit their positions of trust and authority. Detective Santos had received commendations for her work on the case, but the recognition felt hollow, given the human cost of Sterling's crimes. 47 victims had been identified, but investigators suspected that dozens more had been exploited without leaving traces in Sterling's records. Those victims would never know what had been done to them, would never receive the closure that comes with understanding and justice. The case had also taken a personal toll on Santos that she was still processing months after its conclusion. 23 years of police work had exposed her to humanity's capacity for evil, but the Sterling investigation had revealed depths of calculated cruelty that challenged her fundamental assumptions about how civilized society was supposed to function. The hardest part wasn't the murder, Santos reflected during a department debriefing session. Murder is something we understand even when it's brutal. The hardest part was understanding how someone could use their medical training, their position of trust, their professional authority to systematically exploit vulnerable people over years without anyone noticing or stopping them. The investigation had also forced Santos to confront the reality that Sterling's network wasn't unique. Similar operations were almost certainly functioning in other cities, other states, wherever medical professionals could operate with minimal oversight and where vulnerable patients could be exploited without effective recourse. As a result of the Sterling case, Santos had been assigned to a joint federal task force investigating medical crimes across multiple jurisdictions. The work was challenging and often disturbing, but it also provided the opportunity to prevent other victims from experiencing what Sterling's patients had endured. The task force had already identified 17 other physicians operating suspicious practices, 3 of whom had been arrested and charged with crimes ranging from drug trafficking to sexual assault. The investigation was ongoing, with new leads developing regularly as more victims found the courage to come forward and as investigative techniques evolved to identify predators who used medical authority to hide their crimes. For the families of Dr. Marcus Sterling, the case had been a devastating revelation that challenged everything they thought they knew about their loved one. Sterling's daughter, attorney Jennifer Sterling Walsh, had cooperated fully with investigators, despite the personal cost of learning about her father's crimes. "I spent my whole life proud of my father's medical career," Sterling Walsh said in a statement released through her attorney. "Learning about what he really was, what he really did to people, has been the most difficult experience of my life. I can only hope that his victims find some measure of peace, knowing that he can never hurt anyone again." Sterling's ex-wife, who divorced him 5 years before his death, told investigators that she'd suspected her former husband was involved in inappropriate activities, but had never imagined the scope of his crimes. She'd noticed changes in his behavior, unexplained income and patients who seemed confused or upset after appointments, but Sterling had always provided plausible explanations that she'd chosen to believe. "I failed those victims by not asking harder questions," she said during her interview with investigators. "I saw signs that something was wrong, but I didn't want to believe that someone I'd been married to could be capable of such terrible things." The Sterling case had also highlighted the importance of victims speaking out, even when they feared they wouldn't be believed, or when they weren't entirely sure what had happened to them. Many of Sterling's victims had lived for years with the sense that something was wrong, but had been convinced by Sterling's professional authority that their concerns were unfounded. The investigation had shown that predators often rely on their victims' confusion and shame to avoid detection, and that creating environments where victims feel safe reporting crimes is essential to preventing future exploitation. As a result of the case, Riverside County had implemented new protocols for investigating complaints against medical professionals, established a specialized unit for handling crimes involving abuse of professional authority, and created victim services specifically designed to help those who'd been exploited by trusted professionals. The protocols had already led to the identification of 3 other physicians involved in inappropriate activities, though none as extensive as Sterling's operation. The message was clear. The medical community could no longer assume that professional credentials provided immunity from criminal investigation. For Diego Martinez, Jessica Moore, and Leonard Hayes, the sentences they'd received meant that their lives as free individuals were essentially over. Martinez, at 42, would die in prison. Moore might live to see parole, but would spend the prime years of her life behind bars. Hayes had the best chance of eventual freedom, but would be an elderly man if and when he was released. The irony wasn't lost on Detective Santos that the 3 killers would ultimately serve more time in prison than many of Sterling's network associates, whose plea agreements and cooperation deals had resulted in significantly lighter sentences. The complexity of the case had created a situation where the people who'd ended Sterling's crimes were being punished more severely than those who'd enabled them. But the legal system, Santos knew, wasn't designed to weigh the moral complexity of cases like Sterling's. Murder was murder, regardless of the victim's crimes, and society demanded that those who took lives be held accountable for their actions. What mattered more was that Sterling's victims had finally received acknowledgement of what had been done to them, that his network of criminal associates had been exposed and prosecuted, and that future victims would be protected by the enhanced oversight and investigative protocols that had emerged from the case. The investigation had also demonstrated the importance of rapid, coordinated police work in solving complex crimes. The quick arrests of Martinez, Moore, and Hayes had prevented them from destroying evidence or fleeing the jurisdiction, and their confessions had provided the foundation for exposing Sterling's broader criminal activities. This case shows what's possible when all levels of law enforcement work together, Riverside County Sheriff David Patterson said during a press conference announcing the conclusion of the investigation. Local police, county detectives, state investigators, and federal agents all contributed to exposing a criminal network that had been operating for years without detection. The success of the Sterling investigation had also led to increased funding for similar cases and enhanced training for investigators dealing with crimes involving professional exploitation. The lessons learned from the case were being incorporated into law enforcement curricula across the country, ensuring that future investigators would be better equipped to recognize and prosecute similar crimes. For the community of Willowbrook Heights, where Sterling had lived and operated his illegal clinic, the case had been a sobering reminder that evil could hide behind the most respectable facades. The neighborhood association had implemented new security measures and established better communication networks to ensure that suspicious activities would be reported and investigated promptly. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Sterling case was the courage it had inspired in other victims of professional exploitation. The publicity surrounding the investigation had led to hundreds of reports of inappropriate conduct, by medical professionals, therapists, attorneys, and other trusted authorities. While many of these reports didn't rise to the level of criminal charges, they had resulted in professional discipline, civil lawsuits, and increased awareness of the vulnerability of people seeking professional services. The message was clear. Professional authority could no longer be used as a shield for criminal behavior. As Detective Santos reflected on the case from her office overlooking the Riverside County Courthouse, she understood that the Sterling investigation represented both an ending and a beginning. It had brought justice for 47 identified victims and closure for a community that had been shaken by the revelation that a respected professional had been a predator. But it had also opened new avenues of investigation, created new protocols for protecting vulnerable individuals, and demonstrated the importance of believing victims even when their accounts seemed incredible or their memories were incomplete. The case had changed Detective Santos, forcing her to confront the reality that the most dangerous criminals often operated in plain sight, protected by professional credentials and social respectability. But it had also reinforced her commitment to seeking justice for those who couldn't seek it for themselves, to giving voice to those who'd been silenced by shame and confusion. The gate that had started it all, the one that Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman had noticed hanging open on that April morning, had been replaced by Sterling's estate as part of the property's sale. The new owners, a young family with no knowledge of the house's dark history, had painted over the basement walls and converted the space into a playroom for their children. Life had moved on, as it always does, but the lessons of the Sterling case continued to resonate through the law enforcement community, the medical profession, and the lives of everyone who'd been touched by the investigation. Detective Santos closed the case file and locked it in her desk drawer, but she knew that the real work, the ongoing effort to protect vulnerable people from those who would exploit them, was far from over. The Sterling case had been solved, justice had been served, and lives had been saved. But somewhere in America, other predators were still operating, other victims were still suffering, and other investigators were still working to bring them to justice. The case was closed, but the fight for justice never ended, and Detective Maria Santos was ready for whatever came next.